In the summer of 2008, Red Hollow, Oregon was the kind of place where time didn't just slow down. It stood still. Nestled between dense forest lines and quiet back roads, it was the sort of town that people passed through on their way to somewhere else. But for the 200 people who lived there, Red Hollow was home. Life moved in familiar rhythms. The church bells rang at noon, the diner closed at 8, and on hot July days, teenagers went down to the Calamus River to swim. Mason Clark was 17 that summer, tall, with a quiet confidence, the kind that made him a natural leader without saying much. His best friend, Isaiah Romero, had just turned 18. He was louder than Mason, always smiling, always the first to start something dumb just to make the others laugh. Caleb Mendez, 17, was the athlete. He ran cross-country, could climb anything, and was known for pushing everyone to do one more lap, one more hike. And Jordan Kelly, the youngest at 16, was the thoughtful one, artistic, a bit reserved, but never missed a hangout. Together, they were inseparable. Every local teacher, coach, and neighbor knew them as the Four. That afternoon, July 18th, they told their parents they were going to the river. It wasn't unusual. It was pushing 91 degrees. The river sat just outside town, a narrow, winding stretch surrounded by pine, sandstone, and gravel banks. It has always been a favorite spot for teenagers. They parked Mason's old Dodge pickup off a dirt trail just before noon. The keys were later found in the glove box, windows halfway down. They brought sandwiches, bottled water, a cheap Bluetooth speaker, towels, and a shared sense that this was one of the last truly free summers they'd ever have. They weren't planning anything big, just an afternoon in the water before Mason had to start work at his uncle's shop, and Isaiah left for the National Guard that fall. Jordan had been sketching ideas for a mural he wanted to paint in town. Caleb had a GoPro he'd borrowed from a cousin, hoping to get underwater footage in one of the deeper bends. They joked on the way in, laughed, left behind fresh footprints that led directly from the dirt trail to the edge of the water. That was the last time anyone saw them. By 6 o'clock, a fisherman walking the upper trail spotted towels and shoes left on a flat rock near the bend, along with a phone, 2 unopened bottles of water, and an old speaker still playing. He waited a few minutes, called out, but saw no one. At first, it didn't seem like an emergency. But as the sun began to drop and no one returned for the items, he called it in. Deputy Randy Marks arrived on scene at 6:47 p.m. He recognized the truck instantly. Red Hollow was small. Everyone knew Mason's Dodge. What he didn't expect was the emptiness. No sign of a scuffle, no blood, no broken branches or signs of panic, just the belongings, neatly placed as if someone was still coming back for them. By nightfall, the boys' families had been notified. Panic came in waves. Mason's mother arrived shaking, unable to stand on her own. Caleb's father screamed at deputies to do something. Search and rescue were called in by 9 p.m. Helicopters would begin scouring the area by first light, but that first night, it was just flashlights and voices calling out into the dark. The forest swallowed every echo. Early reports speculated they had drowned. The river had unpredictable currents, and 2 drownings had occurred there in the past 20 years. But by morning, nothing surfaced. No bodies, no clothes, not even the GoPro. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They traced scent to the waterline but went no further. A diver from the county arrived by noon. He swept the area twice. Visibility was poor, but the riverbed was shallow and manageable at that section. He found nothing. Divers returned 3 more times over the next week. Still nothing. Back in town, people were already pulling together missing posters. Handwritten signs appeared on telephone poles, gas station windows, and inside the high school gymnasium. Candlelight vigils were organized. Friends from nearby towns joined the search. Dozens walked the trails daily, shouting their names until their voices cracked. Then came the details that didn't make sense. Jordan's phone, left behind, still had 78% battery and no outgoing messages past 12:11 p.m. Mason's shoes were positioned next to his towel, neatly placed side by side, which his mother swore he never did. Caleb's water bottle was half drunk, still capped. Isaiah's wallet was zipped inside his backpack, which had been left under a bush nearby, not far from the trail, an odd choice, considering they were all heading toward the river together. There were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no tire tracks other than Mason's, and no footprints heading away from the river, only toward it. It was like they had walked into the water and disappeared. In a place like Red Hollow, things like this didn't happen. Teenagers didn't vanish in broad daylight, not 4 of them, not without a trace. For the first time in the town's memory, people started locking their doors at night. But what haunted people most wasn't just the loss, it was the stillness, the eerie quiet left behind. Because if they had drowned, their bodies would surface. If they had run, someone would have seen them. But there was nothing. Just a hot summer afternoon, 4 friends, and a stretch of river that never gave them back. And as the hours turned into days, one question settled in everyone's mind, heavier than anything else. Where did they go? By the time the sun disappeared behind the pine-covered ridge, the river was quiet. The towels were still there. The speaker had long since died, and the only sound was the distant thrum of cicadas rising with the night. None of the boys had returned. At first it was assumed they'd lost track of time. Parents made dinner, waited by the windows. Mason's mother sent 2 texts, no reply. Isaiah's sister called once, then twice, no answer. By 8:30, concern turned into something heavier. Something is wrong. It was Jordan's father who called 911 first. His voice cracked mid-sentence, said they should have been back by now, and they weren't answering. Within the hour, Red Hollow's 2 on-duty deputies were en route to the Calamus River. They found the truck. They found the belongings, but they didn't find the boys. The riverbank looked almost peaceful, as if someone had just stepped away. No upturned dirt, no broken branches, no evidence of a hasty exit. 4 towels, 2 backpacks, 1 water bottle half empty. Nothing was missing, except them. Deputy Marks radioed for backup at 9:12 p.m., noting in his report, no signs of violence, no signs of departure. By 10 p.m., the first search team had arrived. Flashlights swept the river's edge while deputies called the boys' names into the woods. Their voices bounced back unanswered. A volunteer fireman brought his personal kayak and paddled out along the slow bend where the river deepened, watching for movement beneath the surface. The night grew colder. No one left. None of the parents could bring themselves to go home. At midnight, the search expanded. Local rangers joined. Bloodhounds from the neighboring county were brought in just after 2 a.m. They sniffed the boys' shoes and towels, locked onto the trail from the truck, and led officers down the path to the bank, but then stopped. The dogs circled, pawed the grass, and sat down. There was no scent beyond that point. It was as if the boys had vanished mid-step. At dawn, the river took on a new tone. It didn't look peaceful anymore. It looked vast, opaque, full of shadows. 2 helicopters were dispatched from Salem with thermal imaging. Nothing. 2 boats from the state's Marine Patrol combed the river's narrow corridor, dragging sonar behind them. Still nothing. A diver went down at the bend near the rock ledge, a common swimming hole. He described the visibility as less than 4 feet, the water cold and unpredictable. He found driftwood, a few cans, no bodies. The parents gathered together at the ranger station. No one slept. Jordan's mom whispered that he was afraid of deep water, that he never swam too far out. Mason's father insisted his son knew the river like the back of his hand, that he wouldn't take risks. Isaiah's cousin brought up how careful he was, how he wore water shoes because he hated stepping on sharp rocks. And Caleb? Caleb had a scar on his back from a tubing accident 2 summers earlier. He never swam in currents anymore. By day 2, the media started circling. Local news trucks lined the road outside the river entrance. Reporters asked about foul play, but the sheriff pushed back, stating there was no immediate evidence of anything criminal. Still, the investigation widened. Every registered sex offender within a 20-mile radius was interviewed. No known threats, no recent parolees, no active warrants. It was a dead zone. Then came the interviews. Friends, teachers, teammates. Each one said the same thing. No, they weren't into drugs. No, they weren't in trouble. They had plans for the fall. Mason was working at his uncle's auto shop. Isaiah had enlisted. Jordan had just started talking about art school. Caleb had applied to 3 colleges. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They had every reason to stay. Search and rescue didn't stop. Over the next 3 days, 96 volunteers joined. They walked miles of shoreline. They scoured trails, creek beds, and ravines. Drones were flown over the forest canopy. Nothing. It was like the entire area had gone sterile. By day 5, the case officially shifted from a missing persons report to a suspicious disappearance. It was a subtle but chilling change. Detectives were brought in from the state. Crime scene specialists re-examined the riverbank. Forensics tested the towels, the speaker, even the bottle caps. No fingerprints beyond the boys, no blood, no fibers, no hair, no DNA that didn't belong. Flyers went up across Oregon. Billboards carried their faces by the following week. Police hotlines logged nearly 400 tips in the first month. Most were dead ends. Sightings in Portland, a rumor in Eugene, a couple in Idaho claiming to have picked up 4 teens hitchhiking who looked scared. That tip was followed closely. The couple later admitted they were wrong. The boys they picked up were younger and alive. What grew heavier wasn't just the grief. It was the stillness. Bodies typically surface within a few days. Drownings rarely go unsolved when boats and dogs are involved. The river gave back what it took, always had. But not this time. Not 4 boys. Not all at once. By week 2, reporters stopped coming. The volunteers dwindled. Divers were pulled from rotation. The official search radius shrunk. Deputies returned to normal duties. But the parents didn't stop. Not then. Not ever. Mason's father hired a private investigator. Jordan's mother continued handing out flyers 2 towns over. Caleb's brother started sleeping in his truck near the river, waiting for something, anything to come up. But as July turned to August, and summer began to slip into something colder, Red Hollow started to realize something that sat deep in the gut. Whatever happened that day at the Calamus River, it didn't follow the rules. And the river, no matter how hard they searched, wasn't giving them back. As the second week passed without a trace, something began to shift, not in the investigation, but in the air around it. The urgency was still there, but it had changed. The community of Red Hollow, once united in shock, began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Parents who once searched together now questioned each other in whispers. Suspicion replaced silence. The initial theory was drowning, a tragic accident. That seemed to make the most sense. 4 teenage boys caught in a current, pulled under and lost to the river, but the facts didn't support it. The Calamus was unpredictable, yes, but in that particular stretch where they were last seen, the current was slow and shallow enough to stand. Divers had been through it multiple times. Dogs had sniffed it clean. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of panic or struggle. If they had drowned, something should have surfaced. Detectives began reviewing every detail again, combing through the scene, the timeline, and their belongings. Still nothing new. That's when the speculation began. Whispers that maybe it hadn't been an accident, maybe someone had taken them, or maybe, harder to admit, maybe one or more of them had planned something. A runaway pact, a secret no one knew about. So they started interviewing. Everyone. Friends, siblings, coaches, teachers. A task force was formed with state police and 2 behavioral analysts assigned to build profiles. They looked for warning signs, emotional distress, sudden withdrawal, suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to July 18th. But the profiles were clean. Jordan had been quieter than usual, but his friends said that was normal when he was focused on his art. Mason had been talking about picking up extra shifts to help his mom with rent. Isaiah was excited about boot camp. Caleb had just gotten a scholarship letter in the mail. If they were planning to run, they left no digital footprint, no cash withdrawals, no unusual purchases, no tickets, no bus records, no burner phones. Their social media accounts remained untouched, no final posts, no cryptic messages, not even deleted ones. Their last known locations were all consistent with the timeline. 4 boys who got to the river that day, and then nothing. Detectives turned to background checks. They went deeper into the boys' lives, looking for anything that could signal risk. Abuse, threats, online predators. They found nothing. No suspicious interactions. No known stalkers. No one with a criminal history in their circles. Caleb's cousin had a misdemeanor drug charge. Jordan's uncle had been through a divorce. That was the closest thing to controversy they found. None of it led anywhere. Still, the questions didn't stop. One local reporter ran a piece suggesting the boys had faked their own deaths. Maybe they'd gone off-grid. Maybe inspired by something online. A YouTube trend. A dare. Theories spread fast. The woods around Calamus were vast. People started saying there were caves, old cabins, even cults hiding out in the national forest. All of it was investigated. All of it came up empty. Then came the turn inward. Detectives started interviewing the families more aggressively, not accusing, but digging. Did Mason ever talk about running away? Has Isaiah been acting out? Did Jordan mention anyone new? Has Caleb seemed different lately? Some families cooperated, others pushed back. Tensions rose quickly. A few parents hired lawyers. One refused further interviews altogether, calling it a witch hunt. What stung most was the implication, however subtle, that someone knew something and wasn't saying it. That maybe the truth wasn't out there in the river or the woods. Maybe it was at home. The town didn't take it well. Red Hollow had always been tight-knit, but now it felt claustrophobic. People avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Conversations dropped when someone walked into the room. An anonymous tip line was opened. Dozens of calls came in. Most were vague or unsubstantiated. One claimed they'd heard yelling near the river 2 days before the disappearance. Another said Mason had been into weird stuff lately. But follow-up interviews revealed none of it held water. Even the park rangers were questioned. One had reportedly seen the boys near the East Ridge Trail 2 days before they vanished. When pressed, he admitted he didn't remember which day it was. The logbook showed no record of anyone patrolling the riverbank on July 18th. That ranger was placed on leave, but no charges were filed. For weeks, the investigation spun in circles. Detectives mapped out timelines down to the minute. They rechecked witness statements, re-interviewed the fishermen who found the belongings. They tested soil samples near the river for signs of a struggle, blood, chemicals, anything. Nothing. The lead detective submitted a theory in his official report that the boys had likely entered the water voluntarily and that something unexpected had occurred, causing them to vanish. He didn't elaborate on what unexpected meant. It was a placeholder, a way to move the case forward without answers. But the families weren't satisfied. Mason's mother went on local television, pleading for help. She broke down mid-interview, saying she felt like people were already moving on, like her son was being erased. Jordan's father posted a message online saying he didn't believe the boys were dead, that someone out there knew something and hadn't come forward. Isaiah's sister started a blog tracking every detail of the case. Caleb's older brother kept driving the river trail, hoping to spot something everyone else missed. The longer the investigation went on without progress, the more theories filled the void. People began to doubt, not just the police, but each other. A once closed town started to unravel under the pressure of the unknown. And through all of it, one fact remained unchanged. 4 boys went to the Calamus River on a clear July afternoon and were never seen again. What had started as a search had turned into something else entirely. Not a race against time, but a slow, widening silence, one that kept swallowing clues before they ever surfaced. By early September, 6 weeks after the disappearance, something started happening in Red Hollow, something quiet, unsettling, and hard to explain. The search efforts had slowed, media presence had thinned out, official statements were rare. But for some people in town, the story wasn't over. They were beginning to notice things, small, strange things, around the river and the woods that didn't fit inside any police report. It started with a fisherman named Mark Ellison, a retired mechanic who lived in a cabin less than half a mile from the East Bend. He'd been launching his boat from the same dock for over 20 years. One night, just before dawn, he stepped outside and found his skiff had drifted 20 yards from the dock, untied, bobbing gently in the water. The rope was still coiled neatly, floating on the surface. Mark told a neighbor the river was dead calm that night. No wind, no storm. No reason for the line to come loose. 2 days later, a group of hikers passing through the upper trail claimed they heard voices echoing from the forest below. A man, a woman, and their teenage son had stopped to take photos near a clearing when they said they heard shouting. Short, sharp, almost like someone calling for help. But when they shouted back, the noise stopped. They waited, listened. Nothing. When asked by deputies, they admitted they couldn't make out words, just tone. It sounded like boys, they said. Maybe two, maybe more. All of them are distant. All of them were scared. Within a week, 2 separate dog walkers reported similar behavior on the lower trail near the old ranger shack. Their dogs, both large breeds, refused to go near the tree line. One sat down and began whining until turned around. The other growled and dug its feet into the dirt, refusing to take another step forward. Both owners were adamant this had never happened before. Deputies checked the area. Nothing unusual. No traps, no animals, no signs of anything out of place. But the reports were written down, stored with the others, and quietly filed away. Then came the sighting. It was October 2nd. A woman named Lenora Briggs, 71, retired schoolteacher, called the sheriff's office from a gas station payphone. She didn't trust cell phones and didn't own one. She told the dispatcher she'd seen something 2 nights earlier, just before dusk, while driving down Route 11. She claimed she'd spotted 4 figures standing at the edge of the woods near mile marker 38. She slowed down, thinking it might have been deer. But what she saw, she said, were boys. 4 of them, barefoot. Shirtless, all standing still facing the trees. She didn't recognize their faces. She couldn't be sure from the distance, but what struck her most was how quiet they were. Not playing, not talking, just standing. She passed by, looked in the rearview mirror, and they were gone. Deputies followed up that evening. They searched the mile marker, hiked into the woods, and found nothing. When asked if she could be mistaken, Lenora didn't flinch. She said she'd taught for 32 years. She knew the difference between kids and shadows. Word of her story got out within days. Some believed her, others rolled their eyes. A few said she was just lonely, or confused, or craving attention. But what unnerved people wasn't her credibility. It was how familiar her description sounded. 4 boys, barefoot, quiet, walking into the trees. That week, the sheriff's office received 2 more anonymous calls. One caller claimed to have seen someone moving through the woods with a flashlight around 3 a.m., though when pressed for details, they refused to give their name and hung up. The second call was from a teen working the night shift at a gas station near Lakefield. He claimed a group of boys had walked past the station windows around 4:30 in the morning. No shoes, no shirts, just jeans or shorts, and never came inside. When he stepped out to check, they were gone. Every tip was followed. Deputies pulled surveillance from nearby businesses, checked wildlife cameras, and sent officers to knock on doors near the sightings. Each time, it led nowhere. The footage showed nothing. The woods offered nothing. And there was no physical trace, no footprints, no fibers, no broken branches, just stories, just voices in the dark. Officially, investigators labeled them as grief-induced anomalies. Unreliable, understandable, but not credible. One detective later said off the record, "People see what they need to see when they're hurting." The department couldn't chase ghosts. They needed evidence, and they didn't have any. But within Red Hollow, the stories didn't stop. A man said his dog woke him up barking at the back door 3 nights in a row. A high school girl claimed she found a carved symbol in the trees near the river trail that wasn't there the week before. A maintenance worker at the Calamus campgrounds said he heard what sounded like a group running through the brush behind the cabins, though when he went out to check, the forest was still. No one could prove any of it, but no one could shake it either. The sightings were inconsistent, hazy, always just out of reach, but they kept coming. By the start of winter, the stories faded again. The woods grew quiet, the river froze in patches, the trails iced over. Most people stopped talking about it, but not everyone. Some still believed the boys were out there, not dead, not gone, just out there. And as the cold settled over Red Hollow, a new question started to take shape, one that chilled people in a different way. If the boys didn't die that day, and if they didn't leave, then maybe they never actually left the woods at all. By the end of November, the trees around the Calamus stood bare, their branches stripped by wind and time. Snow came early that year. Thin sheets of ice began to stretch across the quiet pools near the riverbank, and for the first time since the search began, the woods felt still. Not quiet. Red Hollow had already known quiet, but still, like the river was holding its breath. The official search had dwindled by then. The daily foot patrols became weekly. Helicopters stopped flying overhead. Drones were rarely deployed, but underwater efforts continued longer than most people knew. The state had approved an extended dive operation, bringing in volunteer technical divers from out of county, experts in narrow passages, deep bends, and low-visibility environments. They had one goal: to explore sections of the Calamus previously considered too dangerous or too remote. It didn't take long before the river pushed back. 3 weeks into the expanded dive effort, a volunteer nearly lost his life inside what would later be described as a partially submerged limestone cavity located nearly 8 miles downstream. His name was Brian Leach, a 39-year-old cave diver from Eugene with over 15 years of experience. He had gone into the system alone with a tethered line, equipped with dual tanks and backup lights. His plan was to chart the cave interior, check for remains or personal effects, and return within 20 minutes. But around minute 13, his line went slack. When rescue divers reached him 47 minutes later, they found him conscious but disoriented, wedged between 2 jagged stone walls. His suit was torn at the hip, and his second tank had failed. He later told investigators he had followed a tunnel that shouldn't have kept going, but did. He had gone deeper than intended, deeper than he should have. At one point, he believed he saw something glint, metal, maybe plastic. But when he turned to retrieve it, his light failed. He never found it again. The incident shook the dive team. That section of the cave system was officially labeled a red zone. No further exploration permitted. Too unstable. Too unpredictable. When asked if he believed there were remains down there, Brian hesitated. He wouldn't say yes, but he wouldn't say no either. In the following weeks, divers focused on other areas: natural drop-offs, deep shelves, debris traps, but nothing surfaced. They recovered branches, sediment samples, and bones from animals. A few rusted cans, no phones, no wallets, no bodies. It made no sense. Historically, the Calamus had claimed lives before. 2 drownings in the 1980s, 1 suicide in 1999. All of them recovered within days. In each case, the river gave them back. The current was rough in some areas, yes, but predictable. The water wasn't deep enough to completely hide a person for long, let alone 4. And yet, 6 months had passed since Mason, Isaiah, Caleb, and Jordan vanished, and not one single piece of them had been found. Not a tooth, not a shirt, nothing. The case officially began to cool, not closed, not forgotten, but frozen. Investigators still returned calls, tips were still logged, files remained open. But the active search was halted, funding was redirected, personnel reassigned, public updates grew sparse. The sheriff's office quietly shifted its language from urgent to pending, from ongoing to inactive. In Red Hollow, that shift hit hard. Parents who once gathered every weekend near the trailhead stopped showing up. Posters that once covered bulletin boards began to peel. Candlelight vigils went unlit. The community no longer knew what to say. How long could they call it a search when there was nothing left to search? Caleb's mother stopped answering her phone. Mason's father filed for divorce in December. Isaiah's sister transferred colleges without telling anyone. Jordan's sketchbook, once displayed in the town library, was removed after someone defaced it with a marker, 4 question marks scratched across the page. People needed a way to move on, but no one knew how. A few parents pushed to bring in psychics. One tried reaching out to a documentary crew. Another pitched a petition to restart the dive search. None of it went anywhere. The energy was gone. The fire had dimmed. Grief had settled into routine, dull and cold. Then, in January, something unexpected happened. A steel drum, sealed and partially rusted, was pulled from a side eddy roughly 13 miles from the original disappearance site. It had been snagged on a submerged tree limb. The markings were eroded, and there was no visible connection to the boys. But rumors spread fast. Some believed it was part of a cover-up. Others thought it had been planted. Deputies opened it, cataloged the contents, just rainwater, trash, some decomposed plant matter, nothing of value. Still, the fact that something so large had gone unnoticed for so long unsettled people. It reminded them how much the river could still be hiding. That realization reopened old wounds. If something as large as a drum could remain hidden for months or years, then what about a body? What about four? By spring, the water levels rose again. The ice melted, the paths reopened, but no new searches were planned. The silence had returned, and this time, it didn't feel temporary. It felt permanent. Calamus, it seemed, had made its decision. Whatever had happened on July 18th, it was locked beneath water and stone now, somewhere no one could reach, somewhere not even the best divers were willing to go. And yet, not everyone could let it go. Because if four healthy boys could vanish in a river less than 50 feet wide and never be found, what else could be waiting beneath the surface? By the time the 5-year mark passed, Red Hollow was no longer the same town. The sidewalks were cracked. Storefronts that once stayed open late now stood vacant behind dust-covered windows. The old pharmacy downtown closed for good in 2013. The post office started cutting hours. Even the diner, where the four boys had once gathered after school for fries and milkshakes, reduced its menu, then its staff, and finally, its doors. The disappearance had become a weight that the town couldn't put down. It clung to everything: conversations, anniversaries, school assemblies. Every July 18th brought fresh media calls, out-of-state journalists with microphones asking the same questions, repeating the same images of four smiling teenagers frozen in time. The families responded less each year. Some refused entirely. The pain hadn't dulled. It had just gone quiet. Mason's mother was one of the first to leave. She packed up the house in silence, sold it to a couple from Portland who never asked why the price was so low. She left the keys with a note and didn't say goodbye. Isaiah's father left the year after, moved down to Arizona, took a job as a groundskeeper at a cemetery, stopped returning phone calls. Jordan's mom stayed. She said she couldn't leave, not while her son was still out there. She walked the river trail almost daily, long after the rest of the town stopped. Some said she was talking to him out loud by the water. Caleb's parents split up in 2015. His mother moved in with her sister. His father refused to sell the house. He kept Caleb's room exactly as it was the day he left. The town tried to honor the boys. A memorial plaque was placed near the bend in the Calamus, just above the spot where their towels had been found. 4 names engraved in metal, bolted to a flat stone. Every year someone leaves flowers. No one ever said who. But despite the gestures, nothing truly settled. The grief never evolved into closure. It just sat there, heavy, stagnant, unresolved. And after a while, it started to seep into everything else. In 2016, Red Hollow's high school merged with a neighboring district due to low enrollment. Some blamed economics, others blamed the river. Parents didn't want to raise their kids there anymore. The disappearance had made the town a symbol, not of tragedy, but of something worse: mystery. And mystery didn't comfort anyone. It unsettled them. People moved away. Others stayed but stopped talking about it. They called it that thing that happened, like naming it out loud might bring something back. But even in silence, the ripple effects didn't stop. In the fall of 2017, a tragedy struck again, this time closer to home. Evan Romero, Isaiah's younger brother, died by suicide in his dorm room at Eastern Oregon University. He was 19. No note was found. His friends said he hadn't shown signs, but those close to him knew differently. He'd been 13 when Isaiah vanished. He'd idolized him, spent years tracing maps, digging through news articles, building theories, chasing rumors on Reddit threads. He believed his brother was still alive, and one day, he just stopped believing. His death reopened every wound the town had worked so hard to ignore. For the families, it felt like losing another son. Another piece of the puzzle is gone. The church held a vigil for Evan, but it felt different than the others. The candles flickered slower. People cried harder, because this time there was a body. This time there were answers, and they were worse. Not long after Evan's death, another incident made headlines. A man, middle-aged, disheveled, barefoot, was arrested near the river trail for public intoxication. At first, deputies thought it was routine. But when they asked him why he was there, what he was doing out past midnight in freezing temperatures, he told them he'd heard his son, that he'd been called down to the river, that his son was whispering to him through the trees. The man was Mason's father. He was released 2 days later with a citation, but his words stayed with the officers who heard them. He wasn't yelling or incoherent. He wasn't slurring or stumbling. He was calm, completely certain, like he'd heard something no one else could. After that, even the deputies stopped walking the river alone at night. The mystery hung in the air like fog. Thick, unseen, but always there. Tourism dropped. The campgrounds emptied. Some locals tried to revive interest with festivals, river cleanups, and town fairs. But every time they made progress, some article or podcast or documentary would dig the case back up and the cycle would start again. People would stop at the river plaque, take pictures, and ask questions. Some treated it like folklore. Others took it seriously. But none of them stayed long. The weight of the unknown had done something irreversible, not just to the families, but to the town itself. Red Hollow wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by absence. The kind that never left. The kind that shaped every conversation, every street, every life still rooted there. And as the 10th year approached, the silence grew louder again. Because somewhere under the stillness, beneath the river, the trees, and the passage of time, people started to wonder if something was shifting. If the truth had only been buried, not erased, if something had been missed, and if, after all this time, it might finally come to the surface. On the morning of May 11, 2025, just before sunrise, 2 commercial fishermen working the lower Calamus River were hauling in their trawl nets when something unexpected hit the deck. At first, they thought it was driftwood, a tangled, heavy mass caught in the lower mesh. But when they pulled it apart, one of them froze. Beneath the algae, rope, and river muck was a length of denim fabric wrapped around what looked like a human bone. The men radioed the sheriff's office. The site was just over 30 miles from the original disappearance point, near the wide, slow-moving delta where the Calamus spills into the edge of the National Preserve. It wasn't a place people thought to look. The current that far out was weaker, sluggish, but it had depth, and over 17 years, the river had changed course more than once. Deputies secured the site within the hour. Crime scene technicians arrived by mid-morning. The object was transported under seal to the State Forensic Lab in Portland. Within 48 hours, it was confirmed. The fragment was a human femur, and it belonged to Mason Clark. For the first time since July 18, 2008, one of the boys had come back. The news didn't break immediately. Authorities waited to notify next of kin, re-verify DNA markers, and initiate what they called a quiet phase, a period to reassemble the original files, re-interview surviving witnesses, and prepare for media attention. But in a town like Red Hollow, news doesn't wait. Within days, rumors were everywhere. Mason's body had been found, or all 4, or none, just a hoax. The truth landed hard. By the time the sheriff's office held a press conference, the story was already spiraling. The forensic report confirmed that the femur had been in the water for well over a decade. It showed extensive environmental wear, but something else stood out. 3 parallel indentations near the upper shaft, consistent with ligature marks, not from water damage, not from animal activity, from restraint. The bone also showed signs of healing microfractures, small hairline breaks that had partially repaired before death. It suggested trauma, long-term, slow. This wasn't a drowning. Mason hadn't slipped into the river and been lost to time. He had suffered, and for at least some period, he had survived. The coroner issued the cause of death as undetermined. Too much time had passed. The bone alone couldn't tell the whole story. But it was enough. Detectives reopened the case under new classification, homicide, with signs of prolonged captivity. Jordan's mother was the first family member to speak publicly. Her voice shook as she stood before reporters outside the sheriff's substation. She didn't cry. She just said she always believed they didn't die that day. That someone had taken them, that someone had kept them, and now she had proof. The recovered denim was sent to a lab in Virginia for textile analysis. It was consistent with Levi's, late 2000s manufacture, size 32 waist. That had matched Mason. Soil embedded in the fabric contained trace minerals found only in certain pockets of land near the South Forest boundary, an area that, ironically, had been ruled out early in the investigation because it had burned in a 2011 wildfire. When investigators reviewed satellite imagery from the years following the disappearance, they noticed something they hadn't caught before. In a 2009 image, taken in mid-July, exactly 1 year after the boys vanished, there was a small, square-shaped shadow about 300 yards off a utility access road near mile marker 41. It hadn't been there in 2008. It was gone by 2010. No structure had ever been registered at that location. A search team was dispatched. The site was overgrown, mostly ash and second-growth pines. But near the center they found the outline of a foundation, cement footings, half-rotted wood fragments, and embedded metal loops bolted into the concrete. One of the deputies described it as a holding point. Another called it a cage. A forensic team swept the area. Under 6 inches of soil, they recovered 2 rusted buckles, a strip of molded plastic, and a decayed piece of synthetic cord. DNA swabs taken from the wood yielded partial matches to both Mason and Isaiah. It was the first physical evidence placing any of the boys at a man-made location. The property had never been listed, sold, or claimed. Land records from the early 2000s were incomplete, likely never digitized. But an adjacent lot had once belonged to a man named Joseph Harlan, a reclusive construction worker who had disappeared in 2009. His truck had been found abandoned near the state line. His name had never come up during the original investigation. No connection to the boys, no history of violence, no relatives in Red Hollow, just a name buried in a folder, one of hundreds from that era. The theory that followed was grim, that someone, possibly Harlan, possibly more, had taken the boys, holed them somewhere, that they had suffered for days, weeks, maybe longer, that at least one of them, Mason, had been injured and restrained. Eventually, he died, and that his remains somehow had been moved, intentionally or by nature, 30 miles downstream. But that still left questions. If Mason's femur had been found, where were the others? Why only that fragment? Why now? And how much had the river truly hidden? In Red Hollow, the discovery sparked a new wave of urgency. A reminder that the story was not over, not forgotten, that somewhere, beneath water, beneath time, beneath silence, there were still answers. And the river, after 17 years, had finally given up its first one. The discovery of Mason's bone changed everything. What had been a cold case hovering in limbo for nearly 2 decades was suddenly wide open again. Within weeks, a new task force was formed, combining local law enforcement, state investigators, and federal forensic specialists. They called it a targeted recovery initiative, but behind the careful phrasing was something more urgent. They believed there were more remains to find, and potentially the place where it all happened. The recovered femur, along with fragments of denim and soil samples, had triggered a geoforensic reevaluation of the Calamus corridor. Using updated satellite data and sonar imaging, analysts overlaid water flow models from the last 20 years with new terrain surveys. The river's path had changed multiple times, eroding some banks, depositing debris on others. A section that had once been dense forest near a sharp bend, previously marked inaccessible, had since receded just enough to be explored. Drones were deployed first, then ground crews. On June 6, 2025, in a thicket of undergrowth partially hidden by fallen pine and years of silt buildup, searchers found what looked like the remains of an old hunting cabin. It sat less than a mile from the river, in a shallow depression barely visible unless viewed from above. The roof had partially collapsed, one corner had sunk into soft ground, but parts of the structure still stood, walls, a rusted stovepipe, a doorframe half-hinged and hanging crooked in the wind. Inside, the air was thick, damp. Mold climbed the corners, and rodents had long made it their home. But beneath the decay, investigators began to find things that shouldn't have been there. On the floor, half buried in mud, were the corroded remains of a set of handcuffs. Nearby, under a warped floorboard, they recovered a tangle of nylon rope, discolored and fraying. In the corner, 4 small metal rectangles, rusted nearly beyond recognition, were identified as identification tags, IDs. one for each of the missing boys, still faintly legible under forensic lighting: Caleb Mendez, Isaiah Romero, Jordan Kelly, and Mason Clark. The cabin had no plumbing, no insulation, and no power. But on the back wall, scratched deep into the wooden slats, were markings, scores carved in uneven rows. Some were single lines, others grouped in fives, at least 100 in total. Above them, etched messily and overlapping, were names, not just the boys. A few were illegible, but the first and last to appear clearly read, Mason and Isaiah. Dates were scratched beside them, starting just days after the disappearance and continuing for weeks. It was more than a crime scene. It was a timeline, a record of presence, and possibly a record of survival. Photographs of the etchings were analyzed by behavioral psychologists. The markings weren't uniform. Some appeared rushed, almost panicked. Others were deliberate, methodical. It suggested different individuals at different times. One analyst speculated that the tally marks could indicate days. Others believed they marked something more disturbing. Attempts perhaps to count time in isolation. The wall had become their calendar, their voices. Maybe their only one. Forensics teams spent the next 5 days excavating the site inch by inch. In the dirt beneath the foundation, they found charred remains of what appeared to be makeshift bedding, melted plastic containers, and several long-decayed food wrappers. No bones were recovered, but trace DNA was pulled from the interior, enough to confirm the presence of Mason, Isaiah, and Caleb. Jordan's DNA was not found, though investigators warned it didn't necessarily mean he hadn't been there. After 17 years, environmental degradation could easily erase such evidence. The cabin wasn't listed on any maps. Its foundation had never been recorded with the county. But tax records from the early 2000s showed that the land, nearly 30 acres, had once been part of a private logging lease owned by a man named Joseph Harlan. He'd lived alone, off-grid, and worked intermittently in construction. He'd disappeared in 2009, the same year the cabin likely fell into disuse. In 2009, Harlan was investigated briefly in an unrelated missing persons case in Idaho. He was never charged, and at the time of the boy's disappearance, he had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no connection to Red Hollow. Or so they thought. When investigators revisited his employment history, one detail stood out. In June of 2008, just 1 month before the boys vanished, he'd done a short-term job helping reinforce erosion control barriers along the Calamus River, specifically along the eastern ridge within 3 miles of the spot where the boys were last seen. There was no evidence he had contact with them, no photos, no sightings, but his presence in the area, combined with the cabin discovery, created a chilling possibility that he had watched them, that he'd known the terrain well enough to lead them, by force or deception, to a place no one else even remembered existed. The working theory that followed was sobering. That the boys had not died in the river, that they were taken, possibly by Harlan or someone else, kept hidden, restrained, and possibly moved more than once, that at least some of them had survived for a period of time inside that cabin, that their final days, marked in scratch and silence, had passed in a forgotten room, waiting for a rescue that never came, and that after all these years, the cabin had remained exactly as they'd left it. No one could explain why it had gone unnoticed, how a structure like that, so close to the original search area, had escaped detection. But the woods have a way of reclaiming what they want to hide. The investigation was far from over. But the discovery of the river house, as it came to be called, was the closest anyone had come to understanding what happened. And for the families who had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for answers, it offered a terrible kind of proof. Their sons hadn't vanished. They had been taken, and they had been kept. The forensic analysis of Mason Clark's femur had already changed the course of the investigation, but what came next would challenge everything law enforcement thought they understood about the case. With the discovery of the cabin and the rusted remains of all 4 boys' IDs, forensic teams expanded their testing, pulling every fragment, every fiber, every traceable element into re-examination. Mason's femur was sent to an advanced osteological research lab in Virginia, where they used digital mapping and microscopic imaging to look for signs the initial scans might have missed. What they found was chilling. Along the midshaft of the bone, beneath layers of mineral staining and erosion, were two overlapping microfractures, small hairline cracks that had partially healed during life. They weren't the result of a single traumatic event like a fall or an accident. These were pressure-based, compression injuries, likely from stress or impact repeated over time. The surrounding tissue had decayed long ago, but based on healing patterns, analysts concluded the fractures occurred at least a week apart. This meant Mason had not died immediately after disappearing. He had survived, at least for a period long enough for his body to begin healing. Even more disturbing were the marks at the upper end of the femur, 3 faint depressions, circular, spaced evenly apart. Ligature marks, consistent with nylon or wire restraints. They matched in shape and spacing the fragments of cord recovered from beneath the floorboards of the river cabin. These weren't the kind of injuries caused by accidental entanglement. They were intentional, sustained, and they were inflicted while Mason was still alive. Then, a week later, a tooth fragment was recovered from one of the evidence bags pulled from the cabin's floor debris, originally labeled as non-human. It had been overlooked, sent for reassessment only out of protocol. Under a new scan, the enamel pattern showed distinctive banding. A match came back 2 days later. The molar belonged to Isaiah Romero. It was the second confirmed link to the boys in under a month. With Mason's DNA found in the bone and Isaiah's recovered from the tooth, the working theory began to solidify. Both boys had been alive after the day of their disappearance. They had been held, injured, restrained, and likely kept in that structure, or somewhere like it, for a significant period of time. But that still left Caleb and Jordan. No direct biological material from either of them had been recovered. The IDs confirmed their presence, but without bones or tissue, there was nothing to test. Investigators remained cautious. They couldn't declare them deceased, not yet, not officially. The possibility remained, however faint, that one or both had survived longer, or that their remains had been moved, scattered, lost to the river's endless bends and forest debris. The cause of death for Mason and Isaiah remained undetermined. No full skeletons meant no trauma to skulls, no rib fractures to analyze, no internal indicators. But the evidence they did have, partial healing, signs of restraint, and the timeline of disappearance, pointed toward long-term captivity. The kind that leaves no clean end, no moment of finality. Only silence. At a closed-door briefing with the families, forensic pathologists laid out the findings. They used clinical language, probable confinement, soft tissue degradation, post-mortem dispersal. But the message was clear. The boys hadn't drowned. They hadn't run away. They had been taken and held. And whatever had happened to them, it had happened slowly. That meeting broke something in the room. Mason's mother left early, unable to hear more. Caleb's father sat frozen in his seat for an hour after it ended, saying nothing. Jordan's mom stared at the table, lips pressed white. Isaiah's sister asked one question: if they had time to be scared. The answer was never spoken aloud. In the days that followed, investigators doubled their search radius. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, archaeological specialists trained in bone recovery. They found nothing. The forest had taken too much. Time had erased the rest. The discovery of a tooth and a single bone were miracles, given the conditions. But they were also cruel gifts. Proof, but no closure. Publicly, the sheriff's office released a statement confirming the presence of evidence indicating prolonged restraint and survival beyond the original date of disappearance. Privately, they admitted they were unlikely to recover full remains. If the boys had died at different times in different places, the recovery process could take years or never happen at all. Then came the second wave of analysis, psychological profiling based on the environment. Experts in criminal captivity cases reviewed the cabin, the rope, the carvings in the wall. They noted the variance in the etchings. Some were clustered, some space, some deep, others barely scratched. It suggested a shifting emotional state, possibly multiple individuals carving over time, possibly someone trying to keep track of days or losses. One etching stood out, Just above the final row of tally marks, a single word, scratched so faintly it wasn't visible without angled light. It read, "Cold." That was it, nothing else. Just cold. There was no way to know who wrote it, no way to date it exactly. But for those involved in the case, it spoke volumes. Whoever had been in that cabin, at the end, knew the end was coming. And still, no one could say why it had happened or who had done it. Joseph Harlan remained missing. Nobody. No fingerprints, no digital trail after 2009. He had simply vanished like the boys once had. And while suspicion swirled around him now, legally he was still only a person of interest. No indictments, no proof. Which meant, despite all the findings, the case was still open. The forensic results had answered one question: did the boys survive after they disappeared? But they had raised 100 more, and one of them lingered louder than the rest. How many more answers did the river still have to give? Despite everything, the cabin, the IDs, the tooth, and the femur, no suspect was ever formally named. Investigators never found conclusive evidence tying anyone, living or dead, to the abduction of the 4 boys. The only viable lead, Joseph Harlan, remained a ghost. His car, abandoned near a remote Idaho trailhead in 2009, yielded no body, no blood, no answers. Declared legally dead years ago, his name still lingers at the center of the case, but without proof, the law can't be followed. No new remains have been recovered. Caleb and Jordan's DNA was never found. Searches continued for a while. Deep ground radar, trained dogs, seasonal sweeps, but nothing else surfaced. And yet, every year, as spring turns the river, the Calamus gives up something small. A torn shoe sole, a cracked plastic buckle, a scrap of what might have once been a journal cover. Some are confirmed to be unrelated, others are too decayed to test. But the timing, the slow trickle of clues, keeps the story alive. Locals say the woods never went quiet. Hikers still report strange sounds near the eastern bend, whispers sometimes or cries. Dogs stop walking for no reason. Some refuse to go near the edge. The river is no longer just water in Red Hollow. It's a memory. It's a shadow. It's the place where 4 boys walked in, and something else came out. The case remains open. The files still grow. The names still hang on the plaque by the river. Flowers replaced each year by hands that never leave notes. There's no ending, no closure, only fragments, only the knowledge that someone did this, and somewhere the rest of the truth remains buried. And as long as the river runs, people keep asking the same question: what else is it still hiding?